So we've looked at the railroad coming into Kansas and some of the benefits that the railroad brought to the settlement and development of Kansas with the cattle industry, the development of the cow towns, and Fred Harvey and his restaurant industry. But we want to look at many perspectives in history, and I left you off with the question, so what about the Native Americans who were on these reservations in Kansas? And I want to be very clear, we're talking about Kansas, but also Kansas in the regional uh, aspect with the rest of the Great Plains. So the railroad doesn't just affect people, the Native Americans in Kansas, but the entire Great Plains region that the railroad is expanding into. So you should have two things available to you, these basic questions that are over this article that you're going to read, and you should have access to a paper copy of this article as well as one digitally as well. That's the article Where the Buffalo No Longer Roam. So I'm going to read through this. You're more than welcome to follow along with me, or you can read it yourself and answer the questions if you feel like you can do that faster. So I'm just going to read it, and then the questions will pop up as you go. So Where the Buffalo No Longer Roamed, and this is actually from the Smithsonian.com, July 2012. Gilbert King wrote it. So, it comes from a very credible source. The Transcontinental Railroad connected east and west and accelerated the destruction of what had been in the center of North America. The telegram arrived in New York from Promontory Summit, Utah, at 3:05 p.m. on May 10, 1869, announcing one of the greatest engineering accomplishments of the century. The last rail is laid, the last spike driven. The Pacific Railroad is completed. The point of junction is 1,086 miles west of the Missouri River and 690 miles east of Sacramento City. The telegram was signed Leland Stanford, Central Pacific Railroad, T.P. Durant, Sidney Dillon, John Duff, Union Pacific Railroad, and trumpeted news of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. After more than 6 years of back-breaking labor, East officially met West with the driving of a ceremonial golden spike. In City Hall Park in Manhattan, the announcement was greeted with the firing of 100 guns. Bells were rung across the country from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. Business was suspended in Chicago as people rushed to the streets celebrating to the sounding of steam whistles and cannons booming. Back in Utah, railroad officials and politicians posed for pictures aboard locomotives, shaking hands and breaking bottles of champagne on the engines as Chinese laborers from the west and Irish, German, and Italian laborers from the east were budged from view. Not long after Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, railroad financier George Francis Train proclaimed, "The Great Pacific Railway is commenced. Immigration will soon pour into these valleys. 10 millions of immigrants will settle in this golden land in 20 years. This is the grandest enterprise under God." Yet while Train may have envisioned all the glory and the possibilities of linking the east and the west coast by a strong band of iron, he could not imagine the full and tragic impact of the Transcontinental Railroad, nor the speed at which it changed the shape of the American West. For in its wake, the lives of countless Native Americans were destroyed, and tens of millions of buffalo, which had roamed freely upon the Great Plains since the last ice age 10,000 years ago, were nearly driven to extinction, and a massive slaughter made possible by the railroad. Following the Civil War, after deadly European diseases and hundreds of wars with white men had already wiped out untold numbers of Native Americans, the U.S. government had ratified nearly 400 treaties with the Plains Indians. But, as the gold rush, the pressures of white westward expansion, and land grants for railroad construction led to greater expansion in the West, the majority of these treaties were broken. General William Tecumseh Sherman's 1st Post-War Command, Military Division of the Mississippi, covered the territory west of the Mississippi and east of the Rocky Mountains, and his top priority was to protect the construction of the railroads. In 1867, he wrote to General Ulysses S. Grant, "We are not going to let thieving, ragged Indians check and stop the progress of the railroads." Outraged by the Battle of 100 Slain, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors ambushed a troop of the U.S. cavalry in Wyoming, scalping and mutilating the bodies of all 81 soldiers and officers, Sherman told Grant the year before, "We must act with cruelty against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children." When Grant assumed the presidency in 1869, he appointed Sherman commanding general of the Army, and Sherman was responsible for U.S. engagement in the Indian Wars. On the ground in the West, General Philip Henry Sheridan took on Sherman's command. The Army's troops were well equipped for fighting against traditional enemies, but the tactics of the Plains tribes confused them at every turn. As the railways expanded, they allowed the rapid transport of troops and supplies to areas where battles were being waged. Sheridan was soon able to mount the kind of offensive he desired. In the winter campaign of 1868-69 against Cheyenne encampments, Sheridan set about destroying the Indians' food, shelter, and livestock with overwhelming force, leaving women and children at the mercy of the army and Indian warriors little choice but to surrender or risk starvation. The Transcontinental Railroad made Sheridan's strategy of total war much more effective. In the mid-19th century, it was estimated that 30 million to 60 million buffalo roamed the plains. In massive and majestic herds, they rumbled by the hundreds of thousands, creating the sound that earned them the nickname Thunder of the Plains. The bison's lifespan of 25 years, rapid reproduction, and resiliency to their environment enabled the species to flourish. As Native Americans were careful not to overhunt, and even men like William Buffalo Bill Cody, who was hired by the Kansas Pacific Railroad to hunt the bison to feed thousands of rail laborers for years, could not make much of a dent in the buffalo population. In mid-century, trappers who had depleted the beaver populations of the Midwest began trading in buffalo robes and tongues. An estimated 200,000 buffalo were killed annually. Then, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad accelerated the decimation of the species. Massive hunting parties began to arrive in the West by train, with thousands of men packing .50 caliber rifles and leaving a trail of buffalo carnage in their wake. Unlike the Native Americans or Buffalo Bill, who killed for food, clothing, and shelter, the hunters from the East killed mostly for sport. Native Americans looked on with horror as landscapes and prairies were littered with rotting buffalo carcasses. The railroads began to advertise excursions for hunting by rail, where trains encountered massive herds alongside or crossing the tracks. Hundreds of men aboard the trains climbed to the roofs and took aim, or fired from their windows, leaving countless 1,500-pound animals where they died. Harper's Weekly described these hunting excursions. Nearly every railroad train which leaves or arrives at Fort Hays on the Kansas Pacific Railroad has its race with these herds of buffalo, and a most interesting and exciting scene is the result. The train is slowed to a rate of speed about equal to that of the herd. The passengers get out firearms which are provided for the defense of the train against the Indians, and open from the windows and platforms of the cars a fire that resembles a brisk skirmish. Frequently, a young bull will turn at bay for a moment. His exhibition of courage is generally his death warrant, for the whole fire of the train is turned upon him, either killing him or some member of the herd in his immediate vicinity. Hunters began killing buffalo by the hundreds of thousands in the winter months. One hunter, Orlando Brown, brought down nearly 6,000 buffalo by himself and lost hearing in one ear from the constant firing of his .50 caliber rifle. The Texas legislature, sensing the buffalo were in danger of being wiped out, proposed a bill to protect the species. General Sheridan opposed it, stating, "These men have done more in the last 2 years, and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question, than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary, and it is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. Send them powder and lead, if you will, but for a lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated. Then your parties can be covered with their prairies can be covered with speckled cattle." The devastation of the buffalo population signaled the end of the Indian Wars, and Native Americans were pushed into reservations. By the end of the 19th century, only 300 buffalo were left in the wild. Congress finally took action outlawing and killing any birds or animals in Yellowstone National Park, where the only surviving buffalo herd could be protected. Conservationists established more wildlife preserves, and the species slowly rebounded. Today, there are more than 200,000 bison in North America. Sheridan acknowledged the role of the railroad in changing the face of the American West, and in his annual report of the General of the U.S. Army in 1878, he acknowledged that the Native Americans were moved to reservations with no compensation beyond the promise of religious instruction and basic supplies of food and clothing. Promises, he wrote, which were never fulfilled. "We took away their country and their means of support, broke up their mode of living, their habits of life. introduced diseases and decay among them, and it was for this and against this they made war. Could anyone expect less? Then why wonder at Indian difficulties today?